melody. Push harder. Breathe through the pain.
Imagine waking up every morning knowing that today could be the day you die. Not because of war, not because of crime, but because of something as simple as dirty water, a small cut on your hand, or the food you ate the night before. In the medieval world, survival was never guaranteed. Life itself was a gamble, and most people were losing. The Middle Ages were not an era of heroic knights and noble castles for ordinary people. They were a slow, painful death sentence where hunger, disease, violence, and ignorance hunted humans relentlessly. If you were born into medieval life, the odds were stacked against you from your very first breath, and for many, death was not sudden, it was slow, brutal, and unavoidable. From the moment a child was born in medieval times, survival was uncertain. Infant mortality rates were terrifyingly high. Many babies never lived long enough to be named, dying within days or weeks due to infections, malnutrition, or complications during childbirth. Medical knowledge was almost non-existent, and what little people believed was based on superstition rather than science. Diseases were thought to be punishments from God or the result of evil spirits, not bacteria or viruses. Midwives did what they could, but without clean tools, antiseptics, or proper knowledge, even childbirth was a deadly gamble for both mother and child. A simple fever could turn fatal, and something as minor as diarrhea could wipe out entire families. Living conditions only made things worse. Most medieval people lived in cramped, filthy homes with dirt floors, no ventilation, and animals often sharing the same space. Human waste was dumped into streets or nearby rivers, contaminating water supplies. Clean drinking water was rare, and people often drank ale or weak beer instead, not for pleasure but because it was slightly safer than water. Even then, dehydration and poisoning were common. Food shortages were constant due to poor farming techniques, unpredictable weather, and frequent wars. A bad harvest meant starvation, and famine could last for years. People ate whatever they could find, moldy bread, rotten meat, or plants that sometimes turned out to be poisonous. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people easy targets for disease. Medieval diets lacked essential vitamins, leading to conditions like scurvy, rickets, and anemia. Teeth rotted quickly due to poor hygiene and gritty bread filled with stone particles from primitive mills. Dental infections often spread to the brain, killing people slowly and painfully. There were no painkillers, no antibiotics, and no understanding of hygiene. If you were injured, even a small wound could become infected and turn gangrenous. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, and many patients died from shock or infection, rather than the injury itself. Daily labor was brutal and unrelenting. Most people worked from sunrise to sunset, in fields, mines, or workshops. Rest was a luxury few could afford. Physical exhaustion was normal, and injuries were common. Broken bones often healed incorrectly, leaving people crippled for life. Children worked alongside adults from a very young age, their bodies worn down before adulthood. Life expectancy was low not because people couldn't live long, but because so many died young. Reaching the age of 40 was considered old, and anyone who lived beyond that was seen as incredibly fortunate. Disease was the medieval world's greatest executioner. Plagues, infections, and mysterious illnesses swept through towns and villages without warning, killing indiscriminately. The most infamous was the Black Death, which wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few years. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and entire communities disappeared. But the Black Death was only one of many killers. Smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, leprosy, and typhoid fever were constant threats. There was no understanding of contagion, so sick people were not isolated. Instead, disease spread rapidly through close contact, contaminated food, and infected water. Hospitals existed, but they were not places of healing. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and often run by religious institutions focused more on prayer than treatment. Bloodletting was a common medical practice, weakening patients further instead of helping them. Surgeons reused dirty tools, spreading infections from one patient to another. Pain was considered a test of faith, so suffering was often accepted rather than treated. Mental illness was misunderstood and feared. Those who behaved strangely were believed to be possessed by demons, and were often imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Violence was another constant presence. Wars were frequent, brutal, and destructive. Armies looted villages, burned crops, and slaughtered civilians without mercy. There were no rules of war protecting innocent people. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean death. Even during peace, crime was common, and law enforcement was weak. Punishments were savage, executions were public entertainment, and torture was used to extract confessions. Justice was cruel and often arbitrary. Now pause here for a moment. If you're finding this deep, disturbing, and eye-opening, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This channel dives into the darkest truths of history that most people never talk about. about, and your support helps keep these stories alive. Religion controlled nearly every aspect of life. Fear of hell was used to enforce obedience, and questioning authority could result in death. Women suffered especially hard. Childbirth was deadly, domestic abuse was ignored, and women had little legal protection. Many were accused of witchcraft for being different, outspoken, or simply unlucky. Witch trials led to torture and execution based on paranoia and ignorance. Even children were not spared. Life was not only short, it was filled with constant fear. Fear of hunger, fear of illness, fear of violence, and fear of God. People lived knowing that tomorrow was never promised. Happiness was fleeting, survival was uncertain, and death was always close. The psychological toll of medieval life was immense. Imagine growing up surrounded by death, watching siblings die, neighbors disappear, and entire villages vanish. Trauma was a daily experience, yet there was no understanding of mental health. Grief was constant, and hope was rare. Festivals and religious holidays offered brief escapes, but even joy was overshadowed by fear. Education was limited to the elite, leaving most people trapped in ignorance. Without knowledge, myths and superstitions ruled, creating a cycle of fear and misunderstanding. Social mobility was almost non-existent. If you were born poor, you died poor. Class determined your fate. Nobles lived longer, but even they were not safe from disease or violence. Peasants existed to serve, and their lives were considered disposable. Slavery and serfdom stripped people of freedom and dignity. Escape was nearly impossible. As people aged, life became even harder. There was no retirement, no social security, and no support for the elderly. When bodies failed, people were abandoned. Old age meant weakness, hunger, and eventual death. The medieval world offered no mercy. In the end, medieval life was not a single dramatic tragedy. It was a slow death sentence. People didn't just die, they suffered for years before death finally arrived. Every day was a fight against forces they couldn't understand or control. Compared to modern life, the Middle Ages were a nightmare of constant danger and despair. Survival itself was an act of resistance. The romantic image of medieval times hides a brutal truth. For most people, life was short, painful, and unforgiving. It was not an age of glory. It was an age of endurance. And those who survived did so not because life was kind, but because they were forced to endure the unimaginable.